Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I always thought my late mom's wedding ring would be mine someday. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of her love and a tangible connection to her memory. Growing up, my mom used to tell me stories about how my dad had proposed, how he'd saved up for months to buy the perfect ring. She wore it every day until the day she passed. After that, it became more than just a ring. It was a piece of her, something I always thought I'd inherit. That connection shattered the day I found out my stepmom had sold it. And for what? To pay for her daughter's college tuition. When I asked for it back, she had the audacity to accuse me of being selfish. It all started when I was going through some old boxes in the attic. I'd been searching for a photo album my mom had kept, one filled with snapshots of our family trips, birthdays, and holidays. Instead, I stumbled upon a small, velvet-lined box tucked away in the corner of the attic. It was where my mom's wedding ring was supposed to be. My heart skipped a beat as I opened the box, but instead of the gleaming gold band and delicate diamond I remembered, the box was empty. At first, I thought I must have been mistaken. Maybe it had been moved. I spent the next hour tearing through the attic, checking every box and container I could find, but there was no sign of the ring. When I finally came downstairs, I decided to ask my dad and stepmom if they knew where it was. My dad was in the kitchen, scrolling through his phone. "Hey, Dad," I said, trying to sound casual. "Do you know where Mom's wedding ring is?" "It's not in the attic." He looked up, startled. "It should be in the attic," he said, his brow furrowing. "That's where we put all her things after. You know?" I turned to my stepmom, who had been listening silently from across the room. "Do you know anything about it?" I asked. Her reaction was immediate and suspicious. Her face went pale for just a moment before she quickly recovered. "Oh, I think your dad put it somewhere safe," she said, avoiding my gaze. So it wouldn't get lost. Something about the way she said it made my stomach churn. Her tone was too casual, too dismissive, and the way she refused to look at me only added to my unease. "Are you sure?" I pressed. "Because it's not in the attic, and I've checked everywhere." "I'm sure," she said, her voice tight. "Don't worry about it." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My mom's ring was more than just a keepsake. It was a precious memory, a part of her legacy. The thought of it being gone was unbearable, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized I wasn't going to stop until I found out what had happened to it. I spent the entire night tossing and turning, unable to get the empty ring box out of my mind. My mom's wedding ring wasn't just another keepsake. It was a connection to her love and her life. The idea of it being misplaced felt impossible. My stepmom's reaction had been suspicious, but I couldn't jump to conclusions without more information. The next morning, I decided to confront my dad. He was in the garage working on one of his weekend projects, a cup of coffee steaming on the workbench beside him. I stood in the doorway for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts before blurting out, "Do you know where Mom's wedding ring is?" He looked up, startled, the wrench in his hand pausing midair. "What?" he asked, confused. "What do you mean? It should be in the attic with her other things." "That's where we put it after," he trailed off, his face clouding with memory. "It's not there," I said, stepping closer. "I found the box, but the ring is gone." His confusion deepened, and he set the wrench down. "Gone?" he repeated. "That doesn't make any sense. Who else would have touched it?" I hesitated, unsure how much to say about my suspicions. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I asked, and your wife said you might have put it somewhere safe." He frowned, shaking his head. "I never moved it. It should still be where we left it." His genuine confusion only added to my unease. If my dad didn't move it, and I didn't move it, then there was only one other person who could have touched it. My stepmom's reaction from the night before replayed in my mind. The way her face had gone pale, the way she'd avoided eye contact. That evening at dinner, I decided to bring it up again, hoping the conversation would clarify things. My stepmom was unusually quiet, pushing her food around her plate without eating much. "I've been thinking about Mom's ring," I said, breaking the silence. "It's really important to me, and I'd like to know where it is." Her fork clattered against her plate, and she shot me an irritated glance. "Why are you so obsessed with that ring all of a sudden?" "Because it's Mom's," I said, my voice firm. "It's one of the only things I have left of her." My dad, sensing the tension, looked between us and said, "We just need to figure out where it went. There's no reason to get upset." But my stepmom didn't take kindly to the suggestion. "Fine," she snapped, her voice rising. "I sold it. Okay? I sold the ring. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My dad's jaw dropped, and I stared at her, stunned. You sold it? I repeated, barely able to process what I'd just heard. Yes, she said, her tone defiant. Do you know how expensive college is? I needed the money for my daughter's tuition. It's not like anyone was using the ring anyway. You had no right, I said, my voice shaking with anger. That was Mom's ring. It wasn't yours to sell. She crossed her arms, glaring at me. Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's just a piece of jewelry. Paying for college is more important than keeping some old ring locked away in a box. My dad finally found his voice, his tone sharp and full of disbelief. You sold it without even telling me? How could you do that? Her only response was to roll her eyes and mutter, someone had to do something. I couldn't stay at the table any longer. My appetite was gone, replaced by a swirling mix of anger, betrayal, and sadness. I left the room, needing space to process what I just learned. The realization that my stepmom had sold something so precious, something so tied to my mom's memory, was devastating. But her dismissive attitude, acting as if the ring didn't matter, only made it worse. I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let this go. The room was so quiet that I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock. My stepmom's words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. I stared at her, my mind struggling to process what she had just admitted. You did what? My dad finally said, his voice rising with disbelief. His usual calm was gone, replaced by anger I'd rarely seen in him. I sold it, she repeated, folding her arms as if preparing for battle. I had no choice. Do you know how expensive college tuition is? I did it for my daughter's future. I felt my anger bubbling over, my hands clenching into fists under the table. You had no right, I said, my voice trembling. That ring was Mom's. It wasn't yours to sell. It was one of the only things I had left of her. She let out an exasperated sigh, brushing off my words like they were an overreaction. Not using it, she repeated. It was just sitting in a box collecting dust. It's not like anyone was going to wear it. Her dismissive attitude made my blood boil. That ring wasn't just a piece of jewelry. I snapped. It was a memory, a symbol of her life and her love. How could you think it was okay to sell it? I'm sorry you feel that way, she said coolly, her tone dripping with insincerity. But sometimes, we have to make sacrifices for the greater good. Paying for college is more important than keeping an old ring locked away. My dad, who had been sitting silently with his head in his hands, finally looked up. You sold something that didn't belong to you, he said, his voice tight with anger. You should have talked to me first, talked to us first. That ring meant something to this family. I did what I had to do, she said defiantly. Do you think tuition pays for itself? I couldn't just sit back and watch my daughter struggle while we had something valuable sitting in the attic. Her words stung, not just because of what she had done, but because of how easily she justified it. It was clear she didn't see the ring as anything more than a commodity, something to be traded for convenience. You didn't even consider what that ring meant to me, I said, my voice breaking. You just decided it was yours to sell, like my mom's memory didn't matter. She rolled her eyes, clearly tired of the argument. This isn't about you, she said dismissively. It's about making sure my daughter has a future. I'm sorry you're upset, but I'm not going to apologize for doing what needed to be done. The audacity of her words left me speechless. My dad and I exchanged a glance, both of us reeling from the betrayal. It wasn't just about the ring. It was about the lack of respect, the complete disregard for my mom's legacy and our feelings. I pushed my chair back and stood up, unable to stay in the room any longer. This isn't over, I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. You can try to justify this all you want, but what you did was wrong. And I'm not letting it go. As I walked out, I could hear my dad starting to argue with her again, his voice rising in anger. But I didn't stop to listen. I needed space to think, to figure out how to make this right. After the chaos of dinner, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the moment my stepmom admitted to selling the ring. Her lack of remorse, her justification. It was all too much to process. But as much as I was furious with her, I couldn't shake my frustration with my dad. How could he let this happen? The next morning, I waited until we were alone in the living room. My dad was sipping his coffee, looking exhausted, as if the weight of last night's argument was still pressing down on him. I sat down across from him, and without preamble I said, "We need to talk about Mom's ring." He sighed, setting his mug down. "I know," he said quietly. "I can't believe this is happening either." I wasn't about to let him off the hook that easily. How could you let her sell it? I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. That ring wasn't just some random piece of jewelry. It was Mom's. It was supposed to be mine someday. I didn't know, he said, running a hand through his hair. He looked genuinely distressed, but it wasn't enough to calm the storm of emotions inside me. I had no idea she sold it. I thought it was still in the attic with the rest of your mom's things. Then why didn't you check? I shot back. How could you not notice something that important was gone? He looked down at his hands, his shoulders slumping. I trusted her, he said after a long pause. I never thought she'd do something like this without talking to me first. His words softened my anger, but only slightly. Dad, that ring meant everything to me, I said, my voice shaking. It's not just about her selling it. It's about the fact that she thought it was okay to take something so important and get rid of it without even asking. How do we fix this? He nodded slowly, as if finally understanding the depth of my frustration. You're right, he said. We need to get it back. Hearing him say those words gave me a flicker of hope, but it didn't erase my doubts. Do you know where she sold it? I asked. I don't, he admitted, but I'll find out. I'll talk to her. Part of me wanted to press him harder, to demand that he fix this immediately, but I could see how conflicted he was. My dad wasn't the type to get into confrontations, and I knew this was tearing him apart. Still, I couldn't let him off the hook. Dad, I said, my tone softening slightly, this isn't just about the ring. It's about respecting Mom's memory. You have to make her understand that what she did was wrong. He nodded again, his face lined with worry. I will, he promised. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. As I walked away, I felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a faint glimmer of hope that my dad would step up and fix this. But deep down, I knew it wasn't going to be that simple. My stepmom had made it clear she didn't see the ring as anything more than a means to an end, and convincing her to undo what she'd done would be a battle in itself. Still, I wasn't going to give up. That ring was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a part of my mom, a part of me. And no matter how long it took, I was determined to get it back. After my conversation with my dad, I hoped he would handle things swiftly and firmly. To his credit, he didn't waste any time. That evening, he pulled my stepmom aside and confronted her about the ring. I stayed in the other room, straining to hear their conversation but unable to make out more than muffled voices. Minutes turned into what felt like hours before my dad emerged, his expression grim. She admitted she sold it, he said, sitting heavily on the couch. To who? I asked, my heart pounding. She says it was a jewelry shop downtown, he replied. We'll go tomorrow and see if it's still there. The next morning, my dad and I drove to the store in tense silence. Neither of us knew what to expect, but I was holding on to the fragile hope that the ring was still there. When we arrived, the shop was small and unassuming, its display cases filled with glittering necklaces, bracelets, and rings. The jeweler, an older man with kind eyes, greeted us as we walked in. How can I help you? He asked, leaning over the counter. We're looking for a ring, my dad said, describing it in detail. It's a gold band with a diamond and an engraving on the inside. Forever yours. It was sold here recently. The man nodded thoughtfully and stepped into the back room. A few minutes later, he returned, shaking his head. I remember the ring, he said. It was beautiful, and the engraving stood out. But I'm afraid I sold it about a week ago. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. You sold it? I repeated, my voice trembling. Do you know who bought it? I'm sorry, the jeweler said, looking genuinely sympathetic. I don't keep detailed records of individual buyers for most items. But the customer did mention they were buying it as a gift for their partner. I felt my heart sink even further. It wasn't just gone. It was likely in the hands of someone who had no idea how much it meant to me. Is there anything you can do? My dad asked, his tone more desperate than I'd ever heard. The jeweler sighed, shaking his head. I wish I could help more. If the buyer ever returns for another purchase, I can try to contact you, but I can't make any guarantees. We left the shop empty-handed, and the car ride home was filled with an oppressive silence. My dad's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white, and I sat staring out the window, replaying the conversation in my head. When we got home, my stepmom was waiting in the living room. Well? She asked, her tone more irritated than concerned. They sold it, I said flatly, unable to hide the bitterness in my voice. It's gone. She shrugged as if the matter was settled. It's just a ring, she said. You're making this a bigger deal than it needs to be. Her words reignited the anger I'd been trying to suppress. It's not just a ring, I shot back. It was Mom's. It was one of the only things I had left of her, and you sold it like it was nothing. My dad stepped in before the argument could escalate further. Enough, he said, his voice sharp. He turned to my stepmom, his expression filled with disappointment. You should have told me before you did this. You had no right. She crossed her arms defensively. I did what I thought was best for my daughter, she said, refusing to back down. And now you've hurt this family, he replied. You need to start thinking about how to make it right. As much as I appreciated my dad standing up for me, I couldn't shake the hollow feeling in my chest. The ring was gone, and no amount of arguing or apologies would bring it back. But I wasn't ready to give up completely. I started researching ways to track down lost or sold items, reaching out to local pawn shops and antique dealers, hoping against hope that the buyer might resell it. It was a long shot, but it was all I had left. Leaving the jewelry shop without my mom's ring felt like a heavy weight settling in my chest. The jeweler had done his best to help, but there was only so much he could do. It was sold weeks ago, he explained again, as if hoping to soften the blow. I don't keep records of individual buyers for most items like that. I wish I could be of more assistance. My dad, standing beside me, thanked the man and gently steered me toward the door. I couldn't bring myself to say anything, my emotions swinging between frustration and despair. In the car on the way home, my dad tried to reassure me. We'll figure something out, he said, his voice steady but unconvincing. Maybe the buyer will resell it somewhere, or we can put out some feelers at other jewelry shops. But the guilt on his face told a different story. I could tell he felt responsible, even though the blame didn't rest with him. His wife had made this decision without consulting him, and now he was caught in the fallout. The days that followed were filled with futile efforts to track down the ring. I called every pawn shop, antique store, and jeweler in the area, describing the ring in as much detail as I could. The gold band, the single diamond, the engraving inside. But no one had seen it. Each call ended the same way, with a polite but firm, "Sorry, we don't have anything like that here." Every rejection chipped away at the hope I was desperately clinging to. Meanwhile, my stepmom's dismissive attitude only made things worse. One evening, as I sat at the dining table with my laptop open, scrolling through listings on resale websites, she walked by and let out an exasperated sigh. "You're still obsessing over that ring?" she asked, her tone dripping with annoyance. I turned to face her, my frustration boiling over. Obsessing? That ring was my mom's. It's not something you just move on from. She rolled her eyes, leaning against the doorway with her arms crossed. You're making this into something it's not. It's just a ring. You're being overly dramatic. Her words hit like a slap. Just a ring? I repeated, incredulous. It was a symbol of my parents' love, of my mom's life. It was one of the last things I had to remember her by. How can you call that just a ring? She shrugged, her expression indifferent. You're blowing this out of proportion. What's done is done. It's not like you were wearing it or using it for anything. That's not the point. I said, my voice rising. It wasn't yours to sell. You had no right to decide what it meant or what should happen to it. The tension in the room was palpable. My dad, hearing the argument from the other room, stepped in and placed a hand on my shoulder. That's enough, he said, his tone firm but gentle. He turned to my stepmom, his expression dark. You're not helping. This is a big deal, and you need to stop acting like it's not. She threw her hands up in mock surrender. Fine, she said, but don't expect me to feel bad about doing what I had to do. Her words left me seething, but I knew arguing with her was pointless. She didn't understand what the ring represented, and she clearly didn't care. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I felt the weight of hopelessness settle over me. The ring felt farther away than ever, and I couldn't shake the nagging thought that I might never get it back. But even as doubt crept in, I refused to give up entirely. There had to be a way to find it, to reclaim this piece of my mom's legacy. I just had to figure out how. The tension in the house had been simmering for days, and it finally boiled over. My stepmom's dismissive attitude toward the ring had been the last straw for my dad. Their arguments, once rare and mild, became an almost daily occurrence. The atmosphere was so heavy with conflict that it felt like walking through a minefield. You had no right to sell that ring, my dad yelled one evening, his voice louder than I'd ever heard it. They were in the living room, but their voices carried through the entire house. I had every right. My stepmom fired back, her face flushed with anger. This is my family too. I was trying to help my daughter. Why is that so hard to understand? Her words hit me like a slap in the face, even though they weren't directed at me. I couldn't believe she was still justifying what she'd done. From the safety of my bedroom, I listened to their argument, my heart pounding with frustration and sadness. She's not your family, not the way my late wife was, my dad shot back. That ring wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a memory, a legacy. You sold something you had no claim to, and you didn't even think to ask how it might affect the rest of us. My stepmom's voice softened, but her words were no less cutting. I did what I thought was right, she said. Do you know how hard it's been trying to balance everything? Trying to make ends meet, trying to make everyone happy? That ring was just sitting there, and used. It was the logical choice. It wasn't your choice to make, my dad shouted, the pain evident in his voice. You've hurt this family more than you realize. Their arguments weren't just about the ring anymore. They were about everything it symbolized. My stepmom's refusal to take responsibility drove a wedge even deeper between us. I couldn't look at her without feeling anger, and my dad seemed to be grappling with a mixture of guilt, betrayal, and regret. To make matters worse, my stepmom started avoiding me entirely. If I walked into a room, she'd find an excuse to leave. When we did cross paths, she'd glare at me, as if this entire situation was somehow my fault. She blames me, I said to my dad one evening as we sat in the kitchen. I was helping him with the dishes, trying to distract myself from the chaos that had taken over our home. She's just trying to shift the blame, he replied, his voice tired. She knows she messed up, but admitting that is too hard for her. But how do we move forward from this? I asked, my voice heavy with frustration. Every time I think about the ring, I feel like a piece of mom is gone forever. He put down the dish he was holding and turned to face me. We will find a way, he said firmly. I don't know how yet, but we will. Your mom's memory is worth fighting for. While his words gave me a small measure of comfort, they didn't erase the reality of our fractured family. My dad and I were united in our frustration, but my stepmom's refusal to acknowledge her wrongdoing made it impossible to move forward. The once peaceful house now felt like a battlefield, with every conversation laced with tension. The cracks in our family's foundation had been exposed, and I couldn't help but wonder if they would ever heal. But even amidst the turmoil, I refused to give up hope. I was determined to honor my mom's memory, no matter how difficult the path ahead might be. After weeks of hitting dead ends, I was starting to lose hope of ever finding my mom's ring. The constant tension at home wasn't helping either. Every conversation with my stepmom felt like walking into a battle, and even my dad seemed defeated at times. One evening, while venting to a close friend about the situation, they mentioned something that reignited my determination. There are resale sites specifically for jewelry, they said. People sell old rings and heirlooms all the time. It's worth checking out. It was a long shot, but I had nothing to lose. That night, I grabbed my laptop and began scouring every site I could think of. Auction platforms, classified listings, and specialized jewelry resale sites. The search felt endless. Most of the rings I found were beautiful but generic, and none of them matched my mom's. After hours of scrolling, something caught my eye. The thumbnail was small, but the design of the band was unmistakable. My heart raced as I clicked on the listing, holding my breath. The description detailed a gold band with a single diamond and an engraving on the inside. Forever yours, it was my mom's ring. I stared at the screen in disbelief, a mix of relief and excitement coursing through me. I read the description over and over again, almost afraid it might disappear. The seller hadn't listed much about themselves, only that the ring had been acquired recently and was perfect for someone looking for a timeless piece. Without wasting another second, I sent the seller a message. I introduced myself, explained the situation, and begged them not to sell the ring to anyone else. I told them how important it was to me, how it wasn't just a piece of jewelry but a family heirloom tied to my mom's memory. To my surprise, the seller replied within a few hours. Their message was kind but cautious. I understand how sentimental this is to you, they wrote. I'm willing to hold the ring for you, but I can't do so indefinitely. Also, please understand that I can't sell it for less than the listed price. I clicked back to the listing and felt my stomach sink. The asking price was steep, far more than I could afford on my own. It wasn't unreasonable for the quality of the ring, but I didn't have that kind of money sitting around. I sent a quick reply, thanking them for holding it and promising to figure out a way to pay for it as soon as possible. Then I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. Relief and anxiety battled for dominance in my mind. The good news was that the ring hadn't disappeared forever. The bad news was that getting it back was going to be harder than I'd imagined. The next morning, I told my dad about the listing. I found it, I said, showing him the screenshots I had taken. But it's expensive. I can't afford it on my own. His expression shifted from disbelief to resolve. We'll figure it out, he said firmly. We'll get it back. Despite his support, I knew it wouldn't be easy. My dad's finances were already stretched thin, and I wasn't sure how my stepmom would react if she found out we were trying to buy the ring back. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. The ring was still out there, and I was closer to reclaiming it than I had been since the day I opened that empty box in the attic. When I told my dad about the listing, his reaction surprised me. He didn't hesitate or try to rationalize the expense. We have to get it back, he said firmly, leaning forward to examine the screenshot of the ring. It's the least I can do. I should have protected it better in the first place. His willingness to help brought me a sense of relief I hadn't felt in weeks. Together, we started brainstorming ways to come up with the money. Between us, we could scrape together most of the amount, but it would still require dipping into savings or cutting back on other expenses. But before we could finalize a plan, my stepmom found out, and she was furious. You're seriously going to spend all that money on a ring? She demanded, her voice sharp and dripping with disdain. She had overheard part of our conversation and stormed into the living room, her arms crossed and her expression icy. It's not just a ring, I said, trying to stay calm even as my frustration boiled over. It's a piece of my mom. It's something that matters to me, and it shouldn't have been sold in the first place. She scoffed, shaking her head. After everything I've done for this family, this is how you repay me? Wasting money on something so frivolous when we could use it for something important? Her attempt to guilt-trip us made my dad visibly angry. Wasting money, he shot back. You're the one who sold it without asking anyone. Don't talk to me about wasting money when you're the reason we're in this situation to begin with. Her eyes flashed with indignation. I sold it for my daughter's education, she said defensively. That's a real investment, not some sentimental nonsense. You're letting her manipulate you into thinking this is a bigger deal than it is. I couldn't stay quiet any longer. This isn't manipulation, I said, my voice trembling with anger. You took something that didn't belong to you, something that meant the world to me, and you sold it like it was nothing. You can call it sentimental nonsense, but it's about respect, and you've shown none. Her face twisted into a scowl, and for a moment, I thought she might yell again. Instead, she turned on her heel and stalked out of the room, muttering under her breath about how ungrateful we were. After she left, my dad sighed and ran a hand through his hair. She's not going to make this easy, he said quietly. She doesn't have to make it easy, I replied. We're getting the ring back, no matter what. The argument with my stepmom only strengthened my resolve. If anything, her dismissive attitude reinforced how important it was to reclaim the ring, not just for me, but as a way to honor my mom's memory and push back against the disrespect she had endured. The next day, my dad and I pooled our resources, and with some creative budgeting, we were finally able to come up with the amount needed to buy the ring back. I contacted the seller again, confirming that I could pay, and they agreed to hold it for me until I could meet them in person. But even as the plan came together, I couldn't shake the tension that had settled over our home. My stepmom's anger wasn't just about the money. It was about losing control, about being confronted with the consequences of her actions. As much as I wanted to focus on the relief of getting the ring back, I knew the fallout from this decision would linger long after the transaction was complete. The day I finally held my mom's wedding ring again was a moment I'll never forget. The seller and I met at a small cafe downtown. As soon as they pulled the ring out of their pocket and placed it in my hand, I felt an overwhelming rush of relief and emotion. There it was, my mom's gold band, the diamond catching the light just as I remembered, and the engraving inside. Forever yours. I thanked the seller profusely and handed over the money, feeling the weight of the journey it had taken to get to this point. When I got home, I showed the ring to my dad. He smiled, a mix of pride and sadness in his eyes. Your mom would be so happy that you fought for this, he said quietly. She'd be proud of you. Bringing the ring back into the house didn't resolve the underlying tensions, though. My stepmom avoided looking at it, as if acknowledging its presence would mean admitting she was wrong. Whenever the topic came up, she rolled her eyes or made snide comments about how much drama the situation had caused. She's still blaming me. I told my dad one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. She thinks this is all my fault, he sighed, setting down the dish he was washing. She's embarrassed, he said. She knows she messed up, but admitting that is hard for her. Embarrassed or not, she needs to take responsibility, I said. I don't know how we're supposed to move on if she won't even acknowledge what she did. My dad nodded, but his silence told me he didn't have an answer either. Over time, I accepted that my relationship with my stepmom would never be the same. The trust between us was gone, replaced by a cautious politeness that felt hollow and forced. I couldn't forget the way she had dismissed my feelings, and she refused to admit her actions were wrong. But I didn't let her bitterness overshadow the victory of reclaiming my mom's ring. I bought a small display case for it, placing it on a shelf in my room where I could see it every day. It was a reminder of my mom's love, of the legacy she left behind, and of the strength it took to stand up for something that mattered. In the end, this experience taught me more than I ever wanted to learn about family, boundaries, and resilience. Sometimes, standing up for what's right means facing difficult truths and making hard choices, even if it costs you relationships or peace in the short term. My family might never fully heal from this, but I don't regret a single moment of the fight to get that ring back. It wasn't just about the ring. It was about preserving a piece of my mom, about refusing to let her memory be tarnished by indifference. And though it was a bittersweet journey, I'm grateful that I found the strength to stand up for her and for myself.